we had a season at DreamWorks with VeggieTales where we were bringing in some live action talent to be voice actors, and they don't always work, right? Famously so, Matt Damon in Titan AE is awful. He's not a good voice actor, unequivocally. Like, it just, nope, great actor, fantastic actor,
right.
Not a good voice actor.
The story is every medium has its strengths. Sculpture differs from painting, poetry from prose, ballet from theater. One is not better than the other, but their unique characteristics make them suited for certain kinds of experiences, messages, or audiences. So what are the unique strengths of animated film, as opposed to, say, live action? Today we discuss the peculiar powers of animation. I'm Joel Ackerman. This is Lightwise. J. Chris Wall is an American creator of kids and family redemptive content. He is the executive producer and showrunner of Angel Studios' animated series, The Wingfeather Saga, based on the best-selling books of the same name. Before creating Shining Isle Productions in 2016 to develop and produce entertainment-first family content, Chris spent over a decade producing 16 movies for the popular VeggieTales franchise. He currently lives in Tennessee with his wife and 6 children. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Joel, thanks for having me.
So I want to get right into the unique qualities of animation and what makes it different, say, from live action. So why do, you're a filmmaker, why do filmmakers choose animation over live action?
That is such a great question, because there's really the central question is sometimes it's answered wrong, in my opinion, where something is live action and it really would have been suited for animation, or something is animation and you're like, why isn't this live action? And I think it moves into this area of abstract, right? Like, what is the thing that makes it a bit abstract so my imagination can go further, right? And it can remove me from the boundaries of what the real world is into fairy tale, right?
Yes.
And so does my story, do my characters, are they creatures, right? Like this kind of thing. Does that serve better in animation in the kind of story that I'm trying to tell? Does it help my audience to suspend their disbelief a little further by going into this versus live action, right? I mean, everything is made up, but some is more realistic, some is more fantastic, and some, and so you have an animation, of course, wild fantasy that's like everything's bonkers, right? All the way to some stuff that's pretty grounded, right? It feels like I could go visit that, right? And because like you think about Cars, right? Pixar's Cars, it's pretty grounded. It feels like I'm actually living in the desert, but there's talking cars, right? But otherwise it's pretty grounded, right? There's gravity, there's consequences for things, like it's the moral stakes are paralleled, but it's enough removed in an abstract way that I can engage the story differently than I would if those were humans going around. It has to do, I think, with the environmental stakes, though. Like if I'm looking at what is a real grounded world with real people living in it, and fantastical elements. I just watched a sci-fi thing on the plane that was, real world with a bunch of AI digital stuff on top of it, as they're navigating. And it's, we're crossing a little bit, but the consequences to those character choices in their story apply to real world more than they do kind of the fantasy or abstract of animation. Be my kind of general assessment.
So if you live in this world, like you said, there's animated films. I think of Up, right? That could have been, most of the characters are human.
Totally. Yep.
Could have been live action, but they chose to do animation.
Mm-hmm.
How does that change the experience for the viewer? Mm-hmm. As opposed to if it were live action? Is it go back to the suspension of disbelief? It's easier to go there, and therefore what happens?
Yeah, and I am, to be clear, Joel, I am no expert. I love animation. I'm first and foremost a fan of, and then I've had the opportunity in my career to create some animation. Okay, so to be clear. For Up, I would argue that the pairing of this little boy, this little scout, with this older gentleman to go on this adventure with their dog, right? I think you attach yourself to that story because it's animated, where in live action you might have it might bonk you a little bit, right? Like, I don't know if that relationship would really work or not.
If it would be appropriate.
Or it might feel inappropriate, right? I mean, seriously, you can circumvent some things that would be like stumbling blocks, right? Of like, I don't feel comfortable with this, or I think that's a little too unrealistic, or because again, once the audience suspends their disbelief, the bubble of the mystery of the story that I'm trying to tell them pops, I've lost them, and so in that one, the central idea of this is, right, attaching a bunch of balloons to a house and seeing if you can get it to fly away. This has been done in the real world, right? I mean, it's kind of inspired by the guy who put that on his chair. Remember this? And did it in his backyard, these helium balloons, and he actually flew away and they got in airspace. It was a whole thing. So, so that it really does. In that, it's so funny that you can't ground it in the gravitas. And that story was trying to ground it in a guy who's trying to escape from the loneliness of his living alone, right?
Yeah.
And then the kid stumbles into that story, right? And it becomes a sojourner with him. But putting it into animation allows you to go, okay, a full house. Yep, I'm going to go with that, right? Like there's just things that you allow for. And then, of course, the world becomes more fantastical, right? Because you can, the distances where they go and how they travel, again, become, and of course, ultimately then the dog, coming in and becoming a significant character to that story. Those are elements that you could do in live action, but you'd have to, each time when the dog would move to talking, it's a big leap in live action, right? It's like, oh, we just came into Babe, right?
Right.
Which in itself is a miracle that Babe works, right? I love, it's my wife's favorite film, and that you get live action animals talking, and we accept that with this grounded gravitas of human characters, right?
Right.
And so it can work. It totally can. And that's right. If we look at Babe as a live action kind of flip of kind of this fantastical story, its live action roots allow that story to gain the credibility of the ridiculousness of a pig who could be trained to work with sheep, to be a shepherd dog. That helps that story along, because that's what's meant to feel so silly about it. Where if it was all animated, you're already suspended, so it's like another suspension that you like. But it wouldn't mean anything.
And they couldn't take it as far, right? With the animals never talk to the humans.
Correct.
They talk to each other.
That's right.
But never to the humans.
So in the storytelling, I think it's also fun when, as a storyteller, you start off with, what are the rules of my world, right? How do I want to establish these rules and how they behave? So VeggieTales, right, which I got to be a part of. I was first a huge fan of what Phil Vischer had created, and then got to be a part of it. They had to figure out rules because they're talking cylinders, right, and spheres. And so they had things about like, well, they don't have arms or legs, but we do need them to carry props on occasion. How are they going to do that? Well, we got to be consistent in the world so the audience doesn't just go, what? And so they had rules like, if I'm carrying something, it has to stay within the silhouette of the body, for it to feel like if it's out here just in the
floating,
air. And we broke that rule sometimes, but generally stayed with like, okay, there's, see, what are the rules of the world? Animals only talk to each other. They can't talk to humans. Okay, great. And you hold with that, right? And you have to be really decisive about those things, right? This is kind of quirky, but you might not know this. In VeggieTales, one of the early rules that helped us circumvent a lot of problems, that Phil's mother, who is this brilliant theologian, Bob and Larry, the cucumber and tomato, cannot have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ because they're vegetables. Okay? They can encourage kids and families in the audience to have a relationship with Jesus, right? That's the nature of that series. But they can't themselves because they're vegetables. And
so they stay true to what they felt.
But it was this unwritten, like we didn't tell the audience this.
Right.
But we knew the rules. And so they could play characters like David. So David and the Giant Pickle, he's playing David, a biblical character who could have a relationship with God, right? In some way. Again, rules of the world. What are those rules of the world? And then how are you, so in Up, is there gravity? Is there gravity all the time, right? Is there gravity only sometimes? Is there, like, I would argue in the late stages of Up, gravity kind of lost its thing with the blimp thing, So, but, yes, those rules can be broken or made different in animation, and your brain tracks without any hesitation. In live action, to break that rule, you're suddenly in sci-fi territory, and you probably shouldn't place it in too familiar a setting, right? Now you need to move it to the moon, or you need to move it to Mars or something.
So is there always this element of fantasy or something otherworldly in animation? And therefore, what are those, if that's the case, what are those stories usually trying to do? Are they trying to expand our vision of what life really is? Is there kind of a spiritual element to animation then?
Well, so I think we got to go back to Bambi.
Okay.
Right? So Bambi is attempting to tell a story that everyone understands about nature and hunting and the wilderness and, just that, right?
Yeah.
From the POV of the animals, right?
Right.
So right away, you've just decided to tell a story from a different vantage, and it's fantastical, but then it's true. I think one of the things that in animation that really works, and then works across a broad spectrum, families, is when the emotional truth is deeply true, right, to the human experience. I think when you can land a common human experience, we were just talking about Puss in Boots 2, which I just love so much. And at breakfast, we were talking about, like, when was the moment where the villain was really scary, right? And it was as Puss is sitting at the table and the guy's threatening him and reminds him of how scary he is because he's death, and Puss's arm hair stands up because he's so scared. Well, that's common human experience. We all go, I just related to a cat, a talking cat wearing a cape and a sword with a funny accent sitting in a bar drinking milk.
Right.
Because of a common human experience, a deeply held truth of that experience. So you anchor your story in those things, and suddenly Bambi becomes accessible. It was the brilliance of Walt Disney, is that it's rooted in these very true relational dynamics that we share as children, right? That Thumper, like, oh, I know that kid. Right. I've met him, right? And so suddenly it's not a rabbit anymore. It's a real person. Bambi is not. It's just some deer. It's, oh, I know that type of character. And I think that's where animation really has its great strengths, in the great versions of this, is where they're rooted in these really known characters. And so this is where families can then access them. Sometimes animation is, cartoon. Right. And that's a different thing.
Yeah, and explain the difference between cartoon and animation.
Yeah, cartoon is meant to be farcical. It's pushing at broad stripes of characters. It is Simpsons, and it's commentary. It's meant to be funny, but it's often a bit disposable in that regard, right? Because it's not looking for deep emotional truth per se. It's looking for comedy, right? Okay. I grew up as a child of Looney Tunes. I love Looney Tunes. It's unbelievable how long it continues to work. Like, it's just shocking. It still plays so brilliantly. But it's gags, right? It's just really good gags with really great music and great performances, right? And but it's disposable. Like, there's no real emotional truth, Sure, Roadrunner, and there's some truth to the coyote, but that's not like I'm getting a lot out of it. Whereas in animation, when we think about non-cartoon, we're looking for that kind of deeper connection.
Okay. And you brought up Bambi. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really interesting exercise, especially because Disney is doing this right now, where they're taking their old animated films and they're turning them into live action. I'm interested in getting your opinion on that, because it seems to be everything that animation does. Mm-hmm. Do these live actions only work because of the previous animated film?
Wow, I don't know.
And therefore, is it just a money grab?
That's a great question. That's a seriously great question. So here's, I would say, I am all for a fresh experience. It's like on Broadway. There's a version of a story, and then they restage it. It's the new version of that story. Phantom of the Opera's done this multiple times, right? With like the new version with new takes on the story, whatever. I think it's fantastic. Do new takes on an old, tried and true story, right? It's why the biblical stories keep getting told over and over, right, in different ways, and find new ways. It's, give me the old story, but something new to it, right? Yeah. Familiar but new. I mean, that's classic entertainment, right? Give me something familiar that I can connect to, but make it new, right?
Right.
I still want a chicken sandwich, but what else you got for it? I'm going to put this in it. Right? Oh, that's fantastic.
Variety is the spice of life. So we don't want something that's a throw-up sandwich.
I would argue that, like, in Cinderella, right, was one of the most brilliant retakes of that. The original Cinderella is good. It's very good. It's beautiful. It's lovely. But it kind of plays on one level. It doesn't have you don't get into some of the deeper themes that were in the original fairy tale, right? And I think that the live action version got to explore those and real consequences and what does it take to forgive, right? That became kind of a critical part of that story that was deeply moving for me. So fresh experience. Do I love the animated Cinderella? Yes. And do I love the live action? I actually really do. Some of these others that have become beat for beat, where it's like a mirror of the same, they're less useful to me. Like Lion King, I didn't really understand what. Like, there's new voices. It's like another cast on Broadway, taking your favorite thing and wearing different costumes. But I didn't see any new insight particularly. There were some little things, but so then it becomes an opportunity, in the market to say, hey, take a familiar story. You're probably going to get a bunch of people to watch it and get excited about it, but it may not bring much new to the story. And then sometimes I would say they bring new things to the story that I don't want. I want the old story. Right. So like our recent experience, Little Mermaid was that. Like Little Mermaid is by far my favorite animated film. It shaped so much of my journey in this world. I watched and listened to that over and over as a homeschool kid in eastern Colorado growing up. That movie came out on VHS and I wore it out. I recorded it to cassette and would listen to it in cassette in my car driving, with my family, and every song, every beat, every dialogue. Like I knew that movie intimately. And so when they decided to do live action, I was like, okay, can you bring something new to it? Some of the new elements were like different, but not better. Right. And it was like, well, just don't change it then. If you have a new insight like Cinderella did, do it. If you don't have new insight to bring, and there was little things they did adjustments to that I was like, oh, that's a cool insight. But largely it was just changes or adaptation that wasn't better. It's just different.
So let's go back to Cinderella now. Okay, you said they brought in some things. They were able to explore some emotional things that the animated version did not.
Yeah.
Do you think those same deeper elements could have worked in the animation?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think at the time, Walt Disney was trying to earn an audience in a different way. So it was taking a known fairy tale and adapting it to animation, right? He was struggling to convince the populace that animation was something that anybody should watch as a movie. If you remember, they were like, you can't make a feature animated movie.
Right.
No one will watch it. Animation was for short reels, right? It was Looney Tunes, right?
Right. And
you couldn't sustain 80 minutes, right? There's no way, right? And so in the story constraints that they had at the time, I think that Cinderella fit well, you know, and I would argue Snow White too. For the time, what they could do with Snow White, I hope they can take another version of Snow White and find new ways into that story, because the fairy tale is quite complicated, much like Cinderella. It's complicated, and there's lots of ways you can get into that story and understand it and come out, and you're going to adapt it, because some of those are, difficult. We're all just commenting on minor abstract bits of information. So it's like, until the filmmaker has made that choice and shown us. So we talked about this at breakfast with a friend, but like the Barbie movie, when it was announced, I got nothing. I don't need a Barbie movie, right? It's zero on my radar. And now it's my favorite movie of this year. Like, just astonishing, like I couldn't believe what they got done. So much commentary, so much that you could wrestle with, right? Disagree or agree. Like, wow, we got to have some really in-depth conversations because of a really simple movie that didn't need that, right? But when it was announced, and we all had a lot of fodder about whether it should be made or not be made. But I'm like, wait, let's see what the filmmaker delivers, right? See what the filmmaker delivers, and then talk about whether we think it was, the right thing or not.
I haven't seen the film, but I'm curious. Are you excited for Barbie 2?
I don't know that there's a second one to be made. So, I don't like, whenever I hear a sequel, I'm always like, is there a second movie?
Right.
Is there a story there, right? It's like,
are you confident there will be a Barbie 2?
I don't know.
With the success,
if the filmmaker,
I gotta believe they're gonna be.
I'm sure there's pressure for that, but I think, is there a story that needs to be told? And I think Pixar led the way in this, right? Where they were so careful to come back with, not only will there be a Toy Story 2, but we have something to say that we didn't finish. We started a story here, and we got more to say in 2, and then 3, we're gonna knock you over, because I couldn't believe how good those got. Now, further entries, I'm not as big a fan, but I think when the filmmakers have had the freedom to find the story they have something to say about and bring it to market, that's just fantastic. That's not always the case. Sequels are lucrative, and so some are not successful.
So it seems to me that and this speaks to what you were saying with Walt Disney. Why is it that animations always, even though there's Toy Story, you bring up the various levels of depth, us being able to go to a different place, those seem like things that all benefit adults, because kids will go anywhere you want them to, basically. And yet, animated films are primarily, and you could feel free to disagree with this, you know more about the market than I do, they seem primarily targeted toward children or people with children. Why is that? Why don't you see more animated films just for adults?
That's a huge cultural question that John Lasseter at Pixar was fighting in the early days. I mean, when Toy Story was first coming out, because in the US, animation is a kid's medium. Throughout Asia, animation is for adults.
Right.
But in the US, we just had this segment in our brain. And so the argument that Walt started making, and then John Lasseter picked up, was, we believe animation can be for the family, for adults to consider. And so others have come into this, Cartoon Saloon, Laika, others have come in with really thoughtful entries to try to capture an adult family audience. It's a slow adoption, and we're getting better, right? More and more families are taking this style of art seriously. But I think when you're doing colored things versus the grittiness of a live action Oppenheimer, right? It's just, it's merit and worth. And the other thing is, it's not nearly as as appealing, right, for certain segments, because in live action you have the stars, that amazing actress or actor you get to be chummy with or cheer on, and they're the best versions of you. You see yourselves in them and all that stuff. In animation, we don't have that. You have the animated character, and then there's a voice actor somewhere, right? And they're disassociated individuals in some case. So, it's not as appealing in the entertainment circuit, to get chummy with the voice actors is not as fun as the actual actor in live action. So I think it's going to continue to be a challenge, but the more stories we tell that are challenging the audience and families to deeper thought and to more interesting ideas, we're winning, and there have been some amazing entries. We talked about Puss in Boots 2 earlier, just really captured the American audience in a deep way because it had most importantly, had a really striking villain, right? That was like all adults and kids could recognize. Death, that's our villain. Okay, let's go.
Yeah. Do you think we eventually will get to where, like in Japan, they're making animated films here that are really targeted for adults?
It's a generational question. I think there's a generation of 20-somethings who grew up watching a lot of animation, whether that was Bob's Burgers or, Simpsons or other things like that, who have moved in. Anime is on a big rise in the United States, which is kind of the next step up, in from cartoon to some anime, which is still pretty broad, to the more kind of feature level. So we'll see. I think that much like with VeggieTales, so Phil and Mike were in college and they were doing a kids thing at their church with puppets. And in the room were always the kids right down in front. And then behind them, all the parents or adults and who were just there, And so what Phil and Mike knew when they were entertaining these kids with the puppet show is I've got the kids, but I also want to put a couple things in here to keep the adults into it.
Right.
Right? And that's exactly what Pixar went after. I'm going to make sure that the kids are getting all the right things, but I'm going to reference stuff, whether that's a funny joke or a reference that's a Monty Python type thing that only adult will get, or I think of like Dave and the Giant Pickle, right? And so little David brings pizza, if you remember, to his brothers, and he hands over the pizza, and you hear off screen, I think it's Jimmy, cheese in the crust, that's tremendous. Right? And all the adults laugh, right? Because at that point, we'd just gotten cheese in the crust for like Pizza Hut or whatever, The kids, that's not necessarily a reference. So it's awareness that I have both people in the seat. And I want to make sure I'm keeping, he's looking at his watch. I'm losing him. Got to get that adult back in. The kids I got to put this. And it's just that dueling audience that when you do win them over, it's just amazing. So we talk about feature animation is kind of the gold standard among entertainment properties. It never loses money. Like feature animation, those projects always make money over a long period of time because they're always accessible by families, right? Whereas in live action, it's like the kids are dead on it. This is boring because it's drama, or it's too intense for them,
right?
Or it's kiddie, and so the adults are dead on it. But feature animation has this really amazing slot of just very robust for family entertainment, no matter how silly it is.
So you mentioned in live action, people go, I connect with Tom Cruise, or I like this character, so I'm going to go see his movies because he or she is in the movie.
Yeah.
In live action, does it really work that way for adults? I know kids aren't going, I want to see the movie, or are they? I mean, like Jack Black being in
Kung Fu Panda.
Yeah, or whatever. Is that really? He was also Bowser in Mario, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Yeah. So does that really bringing people into the theater, or is it really just they think that's the best talent available?
So this is a double-pronged question, right? Because does it matter to the kids who see it? No. In fact, they may not even know who that actor is and don't care. Right? Does it matter to the adults who are making the decision to go to the theaters with their kids? Unfortunately, yes.
Really? That surprises me.
It does, yeah. So because they go, Jack Black, he was fantastic in this other live-action thing that I saw him in, right? So I'll see him in the kid thing. I mean, honestly, that's the choice that gets made. It's frustrating. I do think that those actors often earn it because they are great character performers, right? And we had a season at DreamWorks with VeggieTales where we were bringing in some live action talent to be voice actors, and they don't always work, right? Famously so, Matt Damon in Titan AE is awful. He's not a good voice actor, unequivocally. Like, it just, nope, great actor, fantastic actor, not a good voice actor. Voice acting is a very particular thing. So there's some that earn it and do it quite well, and they should be in that. They're fantastic. Antonio Banderas as Puss is just amazing, right? And others that maybe not so much. So that name grabbing is meh. I'm not a fan. Having grown up in that golden era, right, of Lion King and Little Mermaid and Aladdin and all these. I mean, Robin Williams, of course, back then, but everybody else in that cast was just people, just actors who had earned a spot, who you didn't sell it on it. When you're selling a movie, though, it's very useful to take them to podcasts and to late night shows to have the actors. Right? The filmmakers are not as interesting as the actors are, or the sparkly bits, right? So that's like I said earlier with the live action side, is that you get to be around that talent. And if you don't have that talent, you got to trade it on the story, and your story better be really good. You know, it's just, it's, so I get why the choices are made. Sure. And in our case with Wingfeather, it got made, but not intentionally, honestly. We looked for the best performances, and when we heard certain performers went, my gosh, that's brilliant. So Jodie Benson, Ariel, which was such a thrill for me.
Yeah, I imagine.
We earned it blindly. And it was just listening to voices and going, ooh, well, that voice, that sounds like the mom. That sounds like Nia. Wow, that's Jodie? Oh my gosh. Like it was such a surprise for us. And so there was numerous times in our casting where that occurred, where we got to land with some really amazing talent because they earned it. They just delivered something that was really special.
Is it sixes when you look at, I mean, I know with animation you're creating a whole world, but when you compare all the various films that have been done as animation, contemplate a live action version with a ton of VFX that for everything that would have to be VFX, what's your sense of the financial comparison?
I don't know why anybody does animation. It is the most painful art. It is slow. You just work at things in such abstract, separate pieces for so long, and then it only comes together at the very end when it goes out the building, and you really only have a brief moment to see it in its brilliant form, and it's gone. It is a crazy craft.
Yeah,
I love that we do it, but it's astonishing that it happens because it is a slow, methodical, piece by piece working through that live action just simply doesn't have. Even the best live action. So let's say you have a screenplay that goes into storyboarding, and they might do some storyboards to help guide the principal photography. Sure. Once you have principal photography, you've got the movie. And now it's just editorial and getting it to playwright, right? But you've got the movie at that point. And so the bulk of that decision making is, early to middle of the process, and then post happens, right? To finish it up. In animation, we don't know if we've got the movie for a long time because we're watching it in storyboards and we're getting a sense of it. And then the voice actors come in and they change things. But then the animators are going to change it even further. And then all your visual design and color is going to come in and change it even further. Then your sound design is going to push it even further in score. And then you see the final product. And each iteration is like an evolving of it, right? Which, if you're a controlling type person, makes animation a bad idea for you. If you're more of a curious discovery person, what's this art going to be at the next turn? You had an idea going in, what you thought it would be, and then it became something else. And then it became yet again something else. Animation has this amazing unfolding opportunity that it does for itself. And when you hear folks who've worked in animation for a long time then go into live action, it's very difficult for them because in animation, we often get to kind of tell the story 2 or 3 times, right? We kind of get to iterate on the best version of that story, and where is the highs and lows? How do we get into it? And all the craft is the same, whether it's 2D or CG or otherwise. The craft is very similar across it. There's very little variation. And the expansion of whether it's, cartoon like Simpsons where it's very fast, or feature where you take a lot more time with it, is just cost. And it's how many times you're going to hit at the apple and say, let's retake this, let's try that, let's refine the art further, let's get at the better performance. It's almost like if you have a Broadway version of this, you have 48 hours to rehearse and then we're doing it, or we're going to spend 6 weeks rehearsing. Right. Different product, right? And so in animation, that's kind of the difference. Is which one's going to be kind of the faster? You got one idea, you're taking it to the finish, off you go. This one, I have an idea, but I might change it a couple times as it matures through.
That's interesting. It's actually counterintuitive, not knowing anything about animation. I would have thought there would be more control because you're creating every element of the process.
Sure.
But it makes sense now that you're explaining it, because it's so iterative.
It is.
That you really are discovering it as you're going.
And it's a shared dream, right? It's a common shared communal building of a creative project, right?
Yeah.
Like live action is very much the same, where a director, some storyteller says, it's a story about a thing. And the more articulate they can be about that thing, the more everybody on the team can contribute. But in animation, they're contributing everything, right? There's nothing there. You're animating. You're bringing to life something that does not have life, right? And so everybody's contributing. And so the storyteller in that scenario is really trying to cast the best vision of it that everybody can say, oh, we're all going to make this thing. And obviously when that fails, you get people running off this way and that way, and it doesn't come together in a whole.
Right.
Right. And there's a lot of spurious ideas visually and performance-wise, and that it's like, it didn't quite come together, But oftentimes it coalesces into its best version of itself, whatever that story is, right? So one of the things I tell other animators and filmmakers that I've done a few things, so I've been able to kind of see different ways of it unfolding, is to be open to the process of it unfolding, right? To not be afraid of it turning and finding its best version of itself, and to know that honestly, the moment you step foot out the building, your journey is set before you, and the thing is going to be what it's going to be. And so I see some people sometimes that they're going to create a Kia, right? But they're like, no, but I wanted to create a Ferrari. You're making a Kia, but I want a Ferrari. Okay, you can keep straining to make the Ferrari with your Kia that you're actually building, and everyone's going to feel that.
Right.
Because we've all seen those on the roads, right? The Kia that's been transformed with little buttons and things on it that make it look like a Ferrari. Or you can make a really great Kia, and people will love that experience. Right? It's like frame your experience, because that's often the strain, right? Where they have a really great piece that could just hold together very nicely in this thing. And I learned that through VeggieTales, right? Because I'm working with our team, no arms and legs. It's a talking face for 45 minutes, right? And so how are you telling that story? Because each of our movies was 45, basically an hour-long movie, and you got to introduce a character, tell the story arc, and get this worked out with limited sandbox. And there's something about limiting the sandbox and saying, this is our play center. How do we find the most within here? Now, you can find people you work with creatively that are just leaning on the sandbox. I want to go bigger. This is our sandbox. Face inward. Find the most creative ways to solve, right? I mean, early in Veggies, they had a scene in which they needed a character to shrug. It's a cylinder. You can't shrug. And an animator's like, can I try? And did. And I think it's Larry that does it, and does a little, somehow they maneuvered the part of and the audience understood he shrugged. That's all.
Wow.
Now, the limitation says I got to have a shoulder to do that, right? And so I think the opportunity creatively is whatever that shape of that story is, do the best. I don't care if it's a campfire story. Like, just do the best version of that campfire story. If I'm in a campfire story and I suddenly come in with Taylor Swift style visuals, I've just messed it up, right? Mm-hmm. And vice versa. If I set out to do a Taylor Swift type of mega tour, well, don't fall short. Like, you got to deliver on all of it, right? So that's the other thing, is that you see folks who set out, I'm going to go compete with this $200 million feature animation, but we're going to do it with $20 million. No, you're not. I'm sorry, but you just can't. It doesn't work out that way,
right.
And so, but embrace what you have at your disposal. And a lot of going into Wingfeather was this. The inspiration for me was back in 2015 was I'd seen a lot of cheaper animation. So, the going market is about $1 million a finished minute, right? It's actually higher now. It's about $2 million per finished minute. So you look at like an $80, $90, $100 million is the going rate for feature animation. And it was, okay, there's that. And then you drop down to like Simpsons, and it's much less expensive, obviously, 2D animation. And somewhere in between is your premium stuff, right? Like your Troll Hunters or Dragon Prince and some of these. And so they're tackling a certain budget. How do you make because in feature you'd seen these $100 million films get competed with by $20 million film. Mm-hmm. And the $20 million film felt that way. Animation was meh, it's okay. Lighting's meh. Story, it's all kind of meh, right? Mm-hmm. And you're telling me that you want to go out as a premium product, but everybody can tell that you're not. And the audience responds that way, right? I said, I don't want to come in and do a cheap version of. Because Veggies was never a cheap version of. Veggie was in and of itself its own thing.
Right.
Just own the space. Just be entirely your thing. And there were production choices made about how much 2D we would use and how much CG we would use to get it to fit within the sandbox and still give a great story experience. And so in feature, I saw that same problem. And so in Wingfeather, we were like, what do we do differently to come to market differently? I don't want to make a cheap version of those guys, of Pixar, DreamWorks. I'd been at DreamWorks for a number of years, and like I know what they take to produce their films. I don't want to compete with them head to head, frankly. I want to go try to do my own thing differently. And I was very inspired by Leica Animation, obviously out of Seattle, and Cartoon Saloon. Now their stories are very different kinds of stories. So not very kind of Western accessible stories. They were also kind of, and I was like, what if we did a Western sensible type of story, where a hero's journey kind of thing, mm-hmm. but in a visual design that was very different, right? And so as we were fighting that, honestly, we'd struggled to kind of prove to producers and outlets and that it could be done. Spider-Man Spider-Verse came out in the world.
Okay.
And it just changed the world because we had been in this long period of pursuing Pixar, which was this, kind of very shiny, aiming towards photoreal type of CGI animation, mm-hmm. and that was a dominant form in the industry. And everybody said, we want that Pixar look, right? Modeling clay on a partly cloudy day. That's mm-hmm. what we call it. It's just like it all has a similar look. We want the Pixar look.
Yeah.
We want the Pixar. And we had been like, yeah, but there's a point when an audience gets tired of. and we felt very strongly, this is kind of 2015, 2016, there's a CG glut coming where people are just going to get tired of it, and we need to be ready to try a different visual art form. Obviously, we went through a long period of 2D animation in the United States, and that matured into CG animation. What's next, right? And so we had been arguing, you're going to want to go more abstract, more painterly, more just like, let's try something. Spider-Verse comes out, comic book just imprint all over it. And it was just a huge endorsement for the whole industry to go, great, now we can do it. Because it proved it, right? And then we see Mitchell's versus Machines, and now Puss in Boots mess with it a little bit, you know? And so now, and then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is most recently, that are saying, let's entertain the audience differently with our visuals. Let's actually change how we're doing the tapestry. So if you went from like the Muppets style of puppetry, what would be the next version of that? Right. And I don't know what that is yet.
So how did you guys land specifically on the painterly style?
That's a fitment of story question. And the story for Wingfeather Saga is one where there's a story on the page in the novels that goes off the page. Very much like I felt reading Lord of the Rings. Like Tolkien was telling one story, but he's referencing other stories that are happening out over here.
Right.
And in visual storytelling, the more abstract a thing is, the more it asks the audience to engage their imagination to fill in the gaps. So we talk about like an open or closed frame. You know, this is kind of a trick of cinematography, is if in horror or thriller, I leave an open frame so that I get the feeling that something bad could come in, right? And if I want to more, I close the frame so I get the sense that the character's not under threat. And the same type of thing in imaginative storytelling, if I want the audience to feel like the story continues off screen, Mr. Miyazaki, right, his films are dominant in this in animation, of alluding to with shape and silhouette, or even pieces of technology or others just kind of buried in the earth in his visuals that have no explanation. They're not part of the story necessarily, but they set the audience's imagination alight. What is that? He's not going to tell me, and I'm going to let my imagination run. Versus photoreal, so you think of like Zootopia, right? Every pixel's on screen. The audience doesn't really have to engage their imagination because it's all right there. It's all resolved for them. We wanted a different experience. The story fit that because there was more story off screen. And so we wanted to invite the audience in to engage your imagination. And so you do that by moving us more abstract, less photoreal, give them the information they need to understand the characters and the acting in the story, and then give them as much abstract. So that meant that let's set it in a more storybook territory. Storybooks are brilliant at that, right? Thumbing through a storybook and just sitting and staring at the page, let your imagination just goes woof and fills in a story, right? We wanted that experience. And we had that over the years, the art of books, that you thumb through. And so we would have these brilliant art of books at DreamWorks, for their features. And it was like, man.
I had an art of book for the Lord of the Rings series.
Exactly. Even in live action, right? And part of your brain wonders, what would this look like just on screen? Right? Not being translated in our space through the computer, through CGI. What would it look like just like this? Could we do that? And that was kind of the inspiration for us of like, could we do that? Like, could we just put art paintings on screen and let it? And so what we aimed for was, could you just pause and go, that's a storybook page right there. Right. And I want to fill in gaps that are off this corner over here. And Bambi was this so brilliantly, where they would go to just these gouache color washes in the back as the forest. And your brain's like, I totally get it. And I'm filling in detail. And anyways, that fundamental engagement of imagination into the story, imagining more is there than you can see, was principal to us. So it's a guided choice. It wasn't because it's cheaper. Is it less expensive than building out photoreal environments in CGI? Yes, very much so. It really is. It's a smaller sandbox. It's a lot less expensive. And Wingfeather Saga is a traveling adventure. So I'm constantly having to do new worlds because we're moving. The family's on the run. And so if they're moving, that's going to get really expensive to build all those environments. But not if it's 2D, right? If it's paintings, I can move very fast. The other thing that's really expensive in CGI is every little detail in a set is a bit of geometry and texture, and it's just fussy. So if I walk into like a watchmaker's room, all the little trinkets, that's really expensive. It's just very heavy. We talked about this jokingly with the Jonah feature film from VeggieTales. They had a big boat in the movie, and it was just highly detailed. It was really beautiful, but it was so heavy it took like 2 computers to open it. It was just massive at the time, and it was too unwieldy. So they famously had on the deck of the boat there was a barrel that had fish inside of it. Okay, and the person who created this barrel could have made it just a shape and some paint on it, and then a couple of things on top. And it's not real, but it looks fine. It's like in a live action version, it's a piece of cardboard, right? But they had actually modeled every board, textured it, put nails in it, and put fish in the barrel all the way down to the barrel. So the barrel itself was just big and heavy, and it's very expensive. It cost a ton of man hours to make it, right? It's a waste, right? And so that's the flip for us is in that environment, I can do a 2D painting of a watchmaker's interior.
Right.
And you can't actually go grab those watches. The character can't grab it, but it feels rich.
Right.
And so it gave us the ability to go visually rich and sophisticated in a way that we could never afford in CG. So you see, so it's a budget choice, but then find what's the artistic version that brings the audience a great reward.
Well, and that's what I love is that as you said, it fit with the story that you were telling, that
Yes.
it wasn't strictly a financial choice, so that it, again, you're not trying to be something that the story isn't.
That's right. And so one of my favorite features the last couple of years is Klaus. It's Sergio Pablo. It's on Netflix, but it's
Great
amazing.
film, yeah.
And it's a 2D film made to feel like CG. So we're a CG made to feel like we're 2D. And they're 2D made to feel CG. And they did that for audience appeal because audiences in the United States love CG. We love the rounded, they love the character performances. And so they didn't want to do traditional 2D, but make it feel richer. And they did. And they had brilliant techniques for doing so. And it allowed them to do these really amazing environments, just stuff that would be very, very difficult in CG, honestly. But they could pull it off in 2D brilliantly.
So you mentioned being inspired by these art of books.
Yeah.
Is Wingfeather going to have an art of book?
It's funny. Yeah, it's a weird end around, right?
Right.
Because we love art of books. And then we finished Wingfeather at season 1 and we're like, man, it'd be cool to have an art of book. Let's just go make one. And so we went and made it. And actually we were inspired by wanting to tell our story. Like the journey we took in bringing this to life. I highly recommend if people haven't seen it, there's a brilliant set of behind the scenes on Klaus from Sergio Pablo, because he was one of these guys who just championed the story and wanted to make it for a long, long, long time. And they finally got it out in the world. And he has a brilliant series on YouTube on it. But for us, the same thing. We wanted to tell our story of our journey and wanting to tell the story, the obstacles we ran into. And so in the course of the artwork of the book, we're telling the story of the creation of the thing at the same time.
Cool.
Which I think makes it engaging. And I think hopefully useful to other people who love to create. And to say, okay, well, this is the journey they went on.
Yeah.
I'm on a similar journey. Maybe I can learn something from, maybe they can learn something from us that's useful in their own process.
It really is a beautiful show. If people want to watch it, they can watch it at angel.com/wingfeather.
Yep.
Chris, thank you so much for
Thanks,
being
Joel.
here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Lightwise is a video podcast production of Angel Studios released every other Tuesday. To watch more episodes or be notified of new episodes of Lightwise, click subscribe or download the Angel app now, wherever you get your apps. If you'd prefer to listen instead of watch, you can find the Lightwise audio podcast version wherever you get your podcasts. Also, to watch full episodes of the Wingfeather Saga for free and to stay up to date with what's currently happening with the show, go to angel.com/wingfeather. This episode of Lightwise was hosted by Joel Ackerman. It was written and directed by Joel Ackerman, produced by Cameron Jackson and John Shea Van Sickle, and edited by Cameron Jackson, with sound recording by Garrett Briggs and sound mixing by Brian Densley.